Hello, everyone. This is Jarred Marlowe from the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I like to call myself the Blue and Gray's correspondent. And that's just a fancy way of saying that I handle all their social media stuff. So if you've seen any of our Facebook posts or YouTube videos recently, you've probably seen my face or heard my voice. If not, I encourage you to go check them out. So I thought I would come on today and do a video to talk about something that I've been researching the last few years, and that is Southside Virginia and the end of the Civil War. So that last week of the war in Virginia, that first week of April, leading up to the surrender of Robert E. Lee. And I think it's a topic that gets overshadowed because it's kind of out of the way of the action at Appomattox, and it's a great story, and it has kind of a twofold aspect to it. So I'm going to talk about both pieces of it and how they connect today. A little bit of background on me. I was born and raised in Danville, or just outside of Danville, and I grew up learning the Danville side of the story. And I first got introduced to blue and gray through a summer internship that I had when I was at the Virginia Military Institute. I met Lynn, our executive director, that way, and I spent a summer traveling around and working on things with him. And then life kind of took me here, there, and everywhere, all over the globe. And I finally put my roots down outside of Martinsville, Virginia, in a little community called Collinsville. And if you know anything about Virginia geography, Martinsville and Henry County is the next county over to the west from Danville. So then I learned the Henry County Martinsville piece to this story, and I just made a huge connection with the two. And it's a story that I'm going to go be upfront and tell you that isn't much, or listening to this, you won't hear anything new or groundbreaking, really. Maybe a few things I'll sprinkle in that are new information, but uh, I've never found anything that connects the two stories, and that's what makes this unique. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into this. Make sure my screen can share here. All right, so I've titled this April 1865, Danville, Martinsville, and the End of the Civil War. Because to me, the story from Martinsville is almost just as fascinating as Danville's. I know Danville gets a lot of the attention for having Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government there for that last week of the war in Virginia. But I think what's going on in Martinsville could have truly changed the war if one or two things had gone a bit differently. So like I said, I've titled this April 1865 because we're looking at that last 7 to 10 days that are leading up to the surrender of Robert E. Lee. So let me set the scene for you. It's the night of April 8, 1865, and the Confederate government is all sitting around this table in the Sutherland Mansion in Danville, Virginia. You have Davis, George Trenholm, who's Secretary of the Treasury, Judah Benjamin, John Reagan, and a few others, which we'll talk about later. John C. Breckinridge is there. And the mood at the table that evening was fairly light. The men were discussing how to move on from Danville. Danville was never meant to be a permanent capital. It was never meant to be the new Richmond. It was simply a place where they could fall back and punt. They're in Danville now, but they're looking forward. Okay, where do we go from here? What's the next step? And surrender and the dismantling of the government was never thought about. It was, like I said, this was a simple temporary plan that they had. You know, things were going to work out. They still had several armies out on the fronts fighting. Things weren't great now, but they had faced long odds before. They were going to face them again. And the mood changed very quickly when a young man by the name of Lieutenant John Wise entered the room. Wise was a former VMI cadet, and he had been sent out by Jefferson Davis to go and find Robert E. Lee, because since Davis and the government had left the Richmond area, Davis had not heard anything as far as a status update from Lee. He didn't know exactly where he was. He knew that he had left Petersburg, but he did not know where exactly Lee and his men were. So Davis sent out John Wise to go and find Robert E. Lee and get a status update. So Wise has spent the last couple of days riding out towards Richmond, riding east from Danville to go and find Lee. And he gets a report from Lee and he brings it back. And he enters the house through the back and he meets Major Sutherland, who's the owner of the house. And Sutherland takes him into the dining room where Wise announces that he has a message for President Davis. And Davis says that Wise can speak freely to all the men that are in the room. And Wise then delivers the report that things are looking very grim, and in his estimate, Lee will surrender in the next 24 to 48 hours. And at that point, surrender becomes a reality, and the mood darkens because they had never thought about giving up at this point. And with Wise's report, it's now very real, and they have to start figuring out, okay, where do we go from here? What's the next option? And I put a picture of this table on here because if you visit the Sutherland Mansion in Danville today, it's on Main Street. It's very hard to miss. And you go in and tour the mansion because they're open for tours. You'll see this table, and this is the original dining room table that was there when Davis and the Confederate government were there. It was recently returned to the mansion in January of 2023, and it is now there. So when you go there and visit the dining room, you can see the actual table that the men sat around when they heard the news that Lee was about to surrender very soon. So why Danville? I grew up in Danville, and I remember going down Main Street when I was very young and seeing this house that you see pictured here. And I remember even at a very young age, I knew something was different about it. It didn't look like the other Victorian villas that are on Millionaires Row on Main Street in Danville. It looked different. The color was different, the style was different. Even from a very young age, I realized that. So being an inquisitive youngster, I asked the people around me, okay, why is this house different? What's so special about it? And the answer that I got was that this house was the house of William Sutherland. This is Sutherland Mansion. And this is where Jefferson Davis spent the final week of the Civil War. When he came from Richmond, he stayed in this house here in Danville. And as a youngster, I thought that was so cool because, I grew up outside of Danville. The Civil, I was huge into history. I didn't know the depth of it. I just loved the good story of the Civil War. And here's a piece of Civil War history, major history here in my hometown. And that was awesome. But as I grew older, I started to realize that, okay, there has to be a little bit deeper reason for this because, like I said, I grew up in Danville. Danville, this is a post-factory era Danville. And I knew Danville wasn't that special. I mean, at that time, we didn't have Sam's Club. So if you want to go to Sam's Club, you had to go to Lynchburg or Greensboro or Roanoke. Anyway, if you wanted to do something special, you had to leave Danville. So I started thinking about why did they come to Danville? Why was that the place to be? I mean, they could have gone to Lynchburg, they could have gone to Greensboro or somewhere like that. Why Danville? So I started asking those who might know around me, and they said that the answer was because the Richmond-Danville Railroad was the only railroad that was not cut. The line wasn't cut leaving Richmond. So Davis kind of came to Danville by default because it was his only way out. And I was like, okay, that's a pretty good answer. He came to Danville because he didn't have any other options. And I was content with that answer for a while. But then as I got older, I started thinking about, okay, why was the Richmond-Danville line not cut? I'll show you a map here in a little bit to show all the rail lines that were leading in and out of Richmond. So I mean, there were tons of options, but why Danville? Why the Richmond-Danville rail line? And I hope to answer that here in just a little bit. Well, here's a picture of it, and you can see the Richmond-Danville Railroad right there heading west. So let me recap the war to this point very quickly. The Great Compromise of the 1830s had since been pushed away by the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act said was that when new states come into the Union, the people who were living in that territory, soon to become a state, could vote on if they wanted slavery or not. Since popular sovereignty, it was going to be the voice of the people. So you start to see masses of pro-slavery and pro-abolition people moving towards these unorganized territories like Kansas and Nebraska, New Mexico, and Utah. And they're moving there simply to flood the votes and try to get their side to win. This is where we see the entrance of a man by the name of John Brown. John Brown had been active in the eastern part of the country, but he starts to move out in the Kansas territory, him and his sons, and they lead a massacre of pro-slavery, pro-secessionist forces in Kansas in an attack that became called Bleeding Kansas. And then later, John Brown would move towards Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and settle outside there and attempt to lead a slave rebellion at the garrison at Harper's Ferry. And what this did was, and the reason that Brown, I think, is, as noted as he is, was, to me, this was some of the first shots of the Civil War. I know Fort Sumter gets a lot of, or gets credit for being the first shots fired in the Civil War, but you would not have Fort Sumter, in my opinion, without John Brown. John Brown's raid scared a lot of people, and it brought this slavery conflict and tension to the forefront. It became an issue that people knew that they had to deal with. So fast forward to 1860, or excuse me, Brown's raid was in 1859. And moving forward to 1860, Abraham Lincoln gets elected. And with that, the southern states vowed to leave the Union. And the first one does with South Carolina in early 1861, or excuse me, December 1860. And then we have the infamous shots fired at Fort Sumter, which are the official first shots of the Civil War, according to historians. South Carolina militia, led by PGT Beauregard, starts firing on the federally held Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The fort ends up surrendering several days later, and we have the first Confederate takeover of federal territory, and now the war has begun. Now that there is a conflicting army within the United States, according to the Union government, they now have to find a way to squelch it. And General Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers, war hero from decades gone, is still leading the army, and he comes up with this plan called the Great Snake, or the Anaconda Plan, in which he plans to choke out the South by shutting down all its harbors, and then once all the help from the outside is gotten rid of, he's going to then crush them like a snake would by wrapping itself around and just squeezing the life out of the Confederacy. And I put this in there because people don't really take his plan at first, but it's kind of the plan that Grant uses at the end. So I wanted to throw that in there. Move forward to the summer of 1861. Confederate forces are now mustering at Manassas Junction, Virginia, from all across the South. And President Lincoln is very eager to squelch this rebellion as fast as he can. So he tasked General Irvin McDowell with attacking the Confederate forces at Manassas Junction. McDowell tells Lincoln that his forces are not ready. He doesn't have enough. He is not ready for this attack, but Lincoln forces him to attack, and the results are disastrous for the Union forces. And I put this picture on the top left here of the picnickers because local residents thought this was going to be kind of like a show. They came out and they picnicked on the battlefield. What they came to soon realize is that this was not something for their entertainment. This was not something that was going to go away quickly, a one-day event, and that was it. But I always like to throw that picture in there just for the sake of knowing that people thought that it was going to be a day trip, essentially. So the war moves on. I don't want to say nothing happens, but not too much happens after Manassas. For the rest of 1861, both sides are kind of licking their wounds and kind of figuring out, okay, what happened. And we move into 1862. The Confederate Army truly goes on the offensive. We have Jackson's Valley campaign, and then which is still written about and studied in war colleges today. Lee tries to plan an invasion to the north for the first time, and he gets stopped in Maryland at the Battle of Sharpsburg, or the Battle of Antietam. That's a picture of that down there below. Fast forward to 1863, and 1863 is the most pivotal year of the war. We have the Battle of Gettysburg, in which the Confederate Army reaches its northernmost point and then gets turned away on day 3 at the end of Pickett's charge. I'm pretty sure that's the high water mark monument that you see in the top left picture right there. If not, I apologize for that. But there's a monument on the battlefield known as the high water mark, which was the furthest the Confederacy ever got, and the symbol for their or the beginning of the end for them. But then at the exact same time down in Mississippi, you also have an end to the Vicksburg siege with the surrender of Confederate General John Pendleton's forces. So now the Confederates have been defeated in the north, and they have lost control of the Mississippi River, which is the beginning of that Great Snake Plan coming to fruition. And then the third picture here on the bottom right I threw in is also a pivotal point in 1863, and that's the Battle of Chickamauga. Even though it was a Confederate victory, it was very much a Pyrrhic one. And I say that because the Confederates won, but they also lost control of Chattanooga, which was the major rail hub in the South at the time. And with the casualties of Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Chickamauga combined, there's 132,000 people lost within a 3-month span. And that is absolutely incredible. You don't see that in any other war in American history. In 3 months, we lose 132,000 to, killed in action or wounded. Moving into 1864 and 1865, Lee and Grant has been moved to Virginia as a made general-in-chief, and he and Lee are fighting back and forth on the Eastern Theater several times. Lee finally settles into Petersburg, Virginia, into the earthworks there, and the siege of Petersburg begins in 1864. Meanwhile, Union General William T. Sherman has been tasked with going across the Deep South, capturing it, and again closing in that Great Snake Plan that Winfield Scott had theorized several years before. So Sherman's coming across the South. Grant is occupying Lee on the east. There's a couple of generals that try to attack from the Shenandoah Valley: Franz Sigel, David Hunter, and then eventually successfully with Philip Sheridan. And then we move into 1865, where Lee's army is about to leave Petersburg and go on the run. Sherman has now made his way into North Carolina, and that Anaconda Plan is about to squeeze its final enemy. At the same time as all this is going on, Grant has tasked General George Stoneman to ride in from Tennessee and to cut all the rail lines and supply depots and supply factories from East Tennessee into Western North Carolina, into Western Virginia. This is very important because that portion of Virginia had, for the most part, been Virginia and North Carolina had pretty much been untouched throughout the war. So now that the Shenandoah Valley was gone and out of commission, thanks to the burning of Philip Sheridan, Western Virginia, Southside Virginia, and Western North Carolina became a central supply area for Confederate forces. The rail lines were still active there. They could still move goods and people back and forth. So Grant tells General George Stoneman to go and cut the rail lines, destroy the supplies. Again, factoring in that Anaconda Plan, they're all starting to squeeze together, and they're eventually going to meet together. But that's the rate of Stoneman, and we'll get back to Stoneman in a little bit. Excuse me for a second. I'll take a sip of water. So the importance of Danville. Danville was one of the main supply cities for Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. I know a lot of people say, well, the Shenandoah Valley was the breadbasket of the Confederacy, but especially after the burning in the fall of 1864, um, Danville becomes one of the, if not the main supply city for Lee's army. The Richmond Danville Railroad has been untouched throughout the war, though many people have tried to take it and destroy the line. The line has still been there. You can take the Richmond Danville line to Burkeville Junction. At Burkeville Junction, you can hop on the South Side Railroad and go straight to Petersburg, or you can follow the line directly into Richmond. So he has access, or Danville has access to Richmond and has access to Petersburg. You can go north to Lynchburg. You can go south to Greensboro, meaning that troops, supplies, rations can be moved very freely from Danville. And Danville, throughout the war, has been very free of enemy influence. No Union soldiers have come into Danville tried to take it, even though, according to sources, there were, I believe it was 500,000 bread rations and 1.5 million meat rations at all times ready to go in the warehouses in Danville. Danville was a very important city, and its importance grew as the war went on. It became a prison camp, especially as the camps around Richmond started to fail, like Libby prison. When that started to go downhill, they moved all their prisoners to Danville, and then eventually to some to Andersonville. But I'll get into that a little bit later. So Danville was one of the main supply cities for the Army of Northern Virginia, and the person in charge of gathering the supplies was Major William T. Sutherland. Sutherland was the main tobacco person in the city, and he was unable to serve in active combat due to an illness, I believe. So he still wanted to support the Confederacy in some way. So he was made a quartermaster for Danville. Sutherland owned a lot of the warehouses, what's now the warehouse district near the train depots in Danville, and he owned them for his tobacco production. But those soon turned into storehouses and warehouses, or prison warehouses, for the Confederacy. So Sutherland was in charge of gathering supplies, storing them, and putting them on the rail lines. Again, his warehouses were right there at the rail lines, so it was a seamless transition to get them from the warehouses to the lines and then out to where they needed to go. And we see that the bolstering of Danville's support due to an act that was passed in April 1863 that was headed up by Colonel Abraham Myers, who was the quartermaster general for the Confederate Army at that time. It was called the Tax and Kind Act. The Tax and Kind Act said everybody across the Confederacy had to give at least 10% of their agricultural and livestock output back to the Confederacy. So if you had 10 hogs that you were slaughtering this winter, you had to give the pork from one of them to the Confederacy. If you had 10 acres of corn, you would give 1 acre of corn harvested to the Confederacy. Same for all products grown across the board. So 10% of everything agricultural in the South was collected and given back to the Confederate Army. And one place that is not really known about and that can support this theory that Danville was very important was a place called Willowdale. Willowdale is in the northwestern part of Pittsylvania County, and it was the plantation of the Watson family. The Watson family lived on a creek there. And Isaac Watson joined and volunteered to fight for the Confederacy. He was in the 46th Company of the Virginia Volunteers, and you can see that top left, they call themselves the Pig River Invincibles. Watson living near the Pig River, but Watson was soon voted out of command a few months into the war because his men viewed him as being too old. He was in his mid-40s at the time, and he was too old, according to his men, to fight. So they sent him home, but Watson's fire still burned the Confederacy, and he wanted to do everything he could to help. So he established a secret Confederate supply depot in Pittsylvania County for local farmers to gather their goods and store them there. And then he would take them to Danville to Sutherland to put in the warehouses. Now, how do we know all of this about Willow Dell if it was a secret supply depot? Now, I'm not saying that Willow Dell was the only supply depot. You know, there may have been more in the county, definitely more in the area, but we have records from this one. So we know so much about Willow Dell because of the man that's in the top right. His name is Sam Lovelace. Sam Lovelace was a slave on the Cherrystone plantation. There you see the house right there in the middle and the bottom left. That's the little Cherrystone house that's outside of Chatham, Virginia today. Anyway, Sam was a slave there to the Wooding family. And if you know anything about Danville history, there's a statue out front of the city administration building on Patton Street in Danville to Harry Wooding, and you can see that featured there in the top left. Wooding was from this plantation. He fought in the Civil War himself, and then he went on to become one of Danville's longest serving mayors. But Lovelace is a very interesting character because Sam Lovelace received a Confederate pension, and he did so because he reported that he would ride from Little Cherrystone out to Willow Dell to pick up the supplies that had been collected by Watson, and then he would take those to the Tight Squeeze train depot or even into Danville to be stored in the warehouses and then put on the rails out to the soldiers. No one would have suspected him because he was a slave, and no one would have thought that if he were captured that he was actually transporting things for the Confederates. And we have all of this, and we know about Willow Dell and its location because of Sam Lovelace's pension. So he received a pension up to the day he died, and he died at the ripe old age of 104, 105, I believe. I think he passed away in the 1940s or 50s. But he received a Confederate pension for transporting his goods from this plantation, or he would ride from his plantation to Willow Dell to transport goods for the Confederate Army. And those goods soon then went out on the Richmond and Danville Railroad. And you can see a picture to the right here of the main rail line that goes from New York to New Orleans, and how Danville and Lynchburg were still very key parts of it. And to the left there is a picture of one of the Richmond and Danville trail, or it's going to be train engines, and then looks like a piece of stock from the Richmond Danville Railroad. This was the most important railroad that was in that left Danville because it connected it to the state capital and then eventually to the capital of the Confederacy. But from Danville, you could also get to Greensboro and Lynchburg and switch lines to go other places. Danville was the major rail hub of that area, and the Richmond and Danville rail line was so important because Richmond at the time was a very large tobacco market, and that allowed Danville to be a large tobacco market, which would really come into play after the war. Danville had at one time had the reputation for being the world's largest tobacco market, but that would not have been possible without transportation to Richmond. So farmers could grow their crop and put on a train to Richmond to go, out by rail or out by sea. So back to the story. April 2nd, 1865, it's Palm Sunday, I believe, and Jefferson Davis is sitting in the Episcopal Church in Richmond when a courier comes in and gives him a message from Lee that tells him that he has to evacuate Richmond because Lee can no longer hold Petersburg. So Davis then quietly exits the church and starts the process of putting everything that they can possibly fit onto trains, and they start evacuating the city of Richmond. And they start to leave late in the night on April 2nd, 1865. The city eventually gets burned. Some people say that it was the Union soldiers who came in and did it, but it was probably the Confederate soldiers who were leaving, be it by mistake or mishap, or even on purpose to destroy some things that they knew that the Union Army would want, as they eventually would make their way into the city. So Davis and his Confederate government, all their documents, their families, papers, the Confederate treasury, they're all leaving Richmond. Only one rail line that is still available, and that is the Richmond and Danville line. So why was the Richmond and Danville line left intact? Well, my personal belief is that the people of Danville and those in power in Richmond knew the importance of that rail line because Danville was the main supplier for Lee's forces. And keep in mind, Lee's forces fought in and around like Richmond, Petersburg, Fredericksburg. So this could have theory been Lee's main supply line through most of the war, except for a brief time in the Shenandoah Valley, heading north into Maryland and then eventually Pennsylvania. But I believe the people of Richmond and the people in South Virginia knew the importance of this line. So what they did was they had several home guards stationed throughout South Virginia to guard this line. And anytime it would come under attack or was threatened, these home guards would go out and fight against whoever was threatening it. And we know this to be partly true because of guys like Robert Enoch Withers, who is pictured here to the left. Withers was a surgeon. He did a whole bunch of other stuff after the war. He was a diplomat. He was in the Knights Templar. You can look him up later. He wrote an autobiography when he was in his 80s. But Withers was also the captain of the local Danville Home Guard, being that I believe he was injured early on in the war and then came back home. But Withers and his home guard were very instrumental in the Battle of the Stanton River Bridge. The Danville Guard and several other home guards fought back against Union forces who were conducting the infamous Wilson Couts raid to try to cut the lines, and they were pretty much unsuccessful in doing so. It was a failed effort. But the Battle of Stanton River Bridge was one of those main efforts to try to cut the Richmond-Danville line right there at the Stanton River. And the Union forces were repelled by these home guards. Now, if the Richmond-Danville line was not so important, why was it a major focal point in this raid? Grant knew that Lee was getting his supply from somewhere, and he knew that those supplies were coming in most likely from the southern part of Virginia. So that's why you see attacks there on the South Side Railroad leading from Burkeville to Petersburg, and then attacks on the line from Burkeville heading southeast back towards Danville. So both sides knew the importance of this railroad, and the Confederacy knew the importance of keeping it if they wanted to keep Lee's men fed. Davis and his men arrive early in the morning of April 3rd, 1865. Davis then comes up from the train depot and settles in the Sutherland Mansion, which is pictured there at the top left. Danville at that time, like I said, was already a full-on Confederate city. They used warehouses like the one that are pictured in the bottom left as prison warehouses. They had built several prisons in and around the city to house Union prisoners. And there were so many prisoners in these warehouses that Danville has a national cemetery dedicated to those who died while they were POWs. Several thousand men come in and out of Danville in a short period of time. And like I said, those who passed away are buried in the National Cemetery in Danville. Now, here's the thing about Danville. Danville, to be as important as it was and as important as it was about to become, was very much undefended. There have been some attempts to try to fortify Danville and build earthworks and put cannons to surround the city because, again, as the war went on, Danville grew to be more important and the number of supplies there grew, and especially as the Shenandoah Valley was no longer a viable option for supplies, Danville became it. So in the fall of 1864, there was a major effort put underway to build earthworks around Danville, put cannons up on top of those earthworks and the bluffs surrounding the Dan River that run through town. And those efforts started, but then they came to a stop because there was a large prison escape that happened when these Union prisoners were building these earthworks, because that they were the main construction crew, the ones who were in those prisons. So once they had to deal with a prison escape, the earthwork construction stopped and never really got started again. And this is a very rough map of the defenses of Danville, but the main takeaway from this is it was very much undefended, and you could attack it from the north, the south, the east, or the west. It was very much unguarded, which would come into play here in just a little bit. And to the left here, I put this piece of correspondence in here. This is from the Williams-Sullivan papers that are at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And if you go and look up those papers, you'll probably have to get them sent to you. They're scanned copies. You see correspondence from the Confederate government to Major Sutherland and back and forth about the need for supplies and certain supplies like corn. If they were running low on corn, so Sutherland would be asked to go grab corn or go send corn after gathering it from the local farmers. But you see lots of this correspondence in his papers proving that he was very vital in the Confederate war efforts. If you're ever in Danville and you go out Route 58, like you're going towards the airport, at the city farm, you can see some of these earthworks that are still there. So some of the few that are still there, and there's a Civil War Trails sign there to signify that. I put this map together. It's very much pieced together. This map is in full hangs in the Danville Museum of Fine Arts and History, which is in the Sutherland Mansion. But it's kind of a brief overview of where folks stayed. If you look to the left there, you can see the Major Sutherland home, which is where Davis and Trenholm and Stephen Mallory stayed. And you can see extra Billy Smith, who was the governor at the time, stayed in a house just down the street. And where all these buildings were at the time, some of them, the buildings are still there. They look a lot different due to the revitalization efforts of Danville, but some of those buildings are still there, and you can still drive these streets today and see where it was that these men would have stayed during their brief time in Danville. So Danville, April 1865. General Beauregard, who has been in charge of the command, or has been put in command of the forces of Southwestern, Southside Virginia, and Northern North Carolina, sends a message to General Joseph Johnston, who's in the Raleigh area at this point, or in and around Raleigh, that he has arrived in Salisbury, and he finds Stoneman, who, keep in mind, is on his raid in eastern Tennessee, Southwest Virginia. He finds out that Stoneman is actually going to start heading towards Southside Virginia. He's going to start coming southeast and start aiming towards Southside Virginia. And he sends to Johnson that, are there any troops in Danville? Like, should I send some there? Because he knows that Danville is a major city for rations. So was Salisbury. But Danville is a major city for rations, major city for prisoners. So he's asking Johnson, should I start defending this city? Because if Stoneman comes near it, he's going to want to take Danville. Johnson sends back, if you find Stoneman going towards Danville, protect it if you can, as well as Greensboro. So Johnson doesn't really get the importance of it, or doesn't sense it as much as Beauregard does, because he's saying, kind of feel out where he's going and then send troops back and forth, to whichever one we find Stoneman going towards. Keep in mind that this was a very viable option because of the Piedmont Railroad that ran between Danville and Greensboro. So troops could be transported there back and forth with relative ease. So Beauregard at this point isn't too worried about it, but he does sense that something is coming. Fast forward a couple days to April 4th, Jefferson Davis sends to General Beauregard, who has now made his way into Greensboro, please give me any reliable information you have on the movements of the enemy and the disposition to protect the Piedmont Railroad, again, the railroad that runs from Greensboro to Danville. Davis is thinking kind of ahead at this point, and he is trying to, kind of sense where to go from here. like I said before, Danville was a temporary stop, but he's trying to think about where to go from here. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this before. I'll go back to mention it. One of Davis's main things that he does on day one in Danville on April 3rd is he rides and takes a tour of Danville and sees how unguarded it is, and he starts telling the people there, you need to start building defenses now, because he knew that if he was there, Danville was going to be a target, and he saw how truly undefended this new capital city was. So he ordered new defenses be built immediately. So April 4th, 1865, also, Joe Johnson sends to Beauregard. It's too late for Wheeler to attempt to reach Danville. Wheeler would be Colonel James Wheeler, who's pictured here to the right. And Wheeler was dispatched to come down from the Lynchburg area to join Johnston. And Johnston originally had planned for Wheeler to come by and kind of set up a minor defense of Danville and stay there for a little bit until things kind of died down. And then Wheeler would eventually ride to join Johnson at Raleigh. But now Johnson's telling Beauregard, the one help that I'm going to send you is now not coming. He says it's too late for Wheeler to attempt to reach Danville. You must depend on reinforcing it by infantry by rail. Save time. I will tell Wheeler to await further instructions at Raleigh. Any more news of Stoneman? So Johnson makes this decision to send Wheeler straight to him and not screen Danville, not stop by Danville, because Johnson's also feeling pressure from Sherman making his way through the Carolinas. And again, Johnson doesn't really see Danville as much of a threat. And maybe he's being a bit selfish that he needs all the men he can muster, because he is about to face Sherman's army head on. Next day, April 5th, Colonel James Wheeler, sends to Beauregard, I am returning to army with command by order of General Johnson, further reinforcing the fact that Wheeler is not coming, which I knew had to be very disheartening to Beauregard. Next, also on the 5th, Johnson sends to Beauregard events in Virginia, meaning Lee's moving out of Petersburg and being on the run eastward. Events in Virginia will make Sherman move. Wheeler is therefore absolutely necessary here. Returning troops in Ferguson are all that can be afforded to your object, especially as we do not learn Stoneman's objective. No one really knew where Stoneman was going. I'll show you here in a bit that even Stoneman's troops weren't exactly sure where they were going next. So he was kind of a wild card out there. But again, Johnson felt the heat from Sherman, especially now knowing that Lee was on the move. He had given up his fortifications, and things were looking very desperate. Johnson needed all the men that he could muster together, so that's why he called for Wheeler back. Also on April 5th, Davis sends to Beauregard that his reports are very contradictory. Best evidence indicates that Stoneman's forces have not been in Madison. This is in North Carolina, so they have not been south yet. They're still coming. The cavalry you have ordered here will be of special value at this time, referring to Wheeler's cavalry, which was, again, not coming at this time. And Davis lets Beauregard know that he has sent a courier to Lee to figure out Lee's actions and where Lee is and what's going on. And that courier was John Wise. April 8th, 1865. So the day before Lee surrendered, and this is 15 miles east of Henry Courthouse. So we're looking at right now near the Pennsylvania-Henry County line. Wheeler then sends to Beauregard that on his way towards Raleigh, the enemy was still in Henry Courthouse. During the day, he was reinforced by 800 more, and the enemy that is in Henry Courthouse, which is present-day Martinsville, Virginia, the enemy has told the citizens that they will advance on Danville in the morning. So keep in mind, they are 15 miles, or excuse me, they're roughly 20 miles away, 25 miles away from Danville. And when Wheeler sends this, he himself is 15 miles east of Martinsville, and he's telling Beauregard, hey, the enemy army is, pretty much a day's march from the Confederate capital. And they tell the residents of Martinsville that they're coming. And so that'd be kind of a terrifying thought for Beauregard. So April 8th, also that morning of the 8th, Wheeler sends to Beauregard that the enemy attacked him at 7 a.m. There were several losses on his side. Reports that Stoneman is at Christiansburg and has sent troops on all the roads, which are to concentrate on Danville. The force that attacked me was 800 strong, and our loss is small. I'm now on the pike between Henry Courthouse or Martinsville and Danville, which is modern day Route 58 that connects the two. And he has scouts that are going to watch for enemy movement. So when Wheeler comes down, like I said, we'll talk more about this here in just a second. When Wheeler is coming down, he sort of disobeys orders a little bit and kind of screens them. Okay, like what's, we know Stoneman's out towards the west. I'm going to kind of ride by here just to see what I can see. He ends up camping in Martinsville that night, and then he runs across a detachment of Stoneman's cavalry, and they get into a little skirmish, and Wheeler lets Beauregard know, hey, I've skirmished them. They're in Martinsville, and they say they're coming. So going back to what we talked about before, that night of April 8th, here are the men that are sitting around that table, and they now have a decision to make. Stoneman's cavalry is just 20 some miles east. They're a cavalry group, so they can move with relative quickness. Here they are, undefended in this capital. What's next? Defeat is that feeling of the defeat as set in now, as it is very imminent. Next day, April 9th, 1865, one of Lee's staffers confers that reliably reported that Lee and his army capitulated yesterday, and you could depend on this. And this is sent to George Brent, who is in the Danville area at that time. And with this, Davis and his men, the government, hop on those same trains that brought them to Danville, and they head south on the Piedmont Railroad towards Greensboro, which they narrowly avoid capture on the way to Greensboro. But they start heading in that direction. And this is a picture not of the exact train that brought Davis to Danville and then carried him out a week later, but it is the exact model of train that Davis would have ridden on. So going back towards Stoneman's raid. Stoneman's raid starts in March of 1865, and he starts in Kingsport, Tennessee. Now, Stoneman at this time is kind of a not well-liked figure in the Union Army. He has been given several tasks in the past before, and he has kind of tried to get glory for himself by going above and beyond. And by going above and beyond, sometimes that means he doesn't follow orders. So he knows that the end is coming, and he's trying to end the war with a good reputation going forward. He's going to now follow the orders that he's given. He's going to stick to them no matter what, because he needs to end the war on good terms. Now, he is very slow to begin this. Grant had ordered him at the end of 1864 to begin this raid, and Grant's kind of checking on him, and Grant sends Stoneman's commander, General George Thomas, a message like, does Stoneman have everything he needs? Make sure he has everything he needs so he can leave right away. And Stoneman, kind of gets prodded by Thomas, like, hey, you've got everything, start this now. And his men leave Kingsport, Tennessee in late March of April 1865, and they ride up what is essentially now Interstate 81, attacking towns throughout there. So here's a map of Stoneman's raid in Virginia. You can see that he followed the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad as it came up from Tennessee into Southwest Virginia, and you can see some of the towns there. Excuse me, I'll take a sip of water. Some towns that are still there, like Wytheville, Hillsville, Christiansburg, Salem, Big Lick, which is now known as Roanoke, and there's a couple others. There's Jacksonville right there in the center of the screen. Jacksonville is now known as Floyd, Virginia, and then south of that, Taylorsville, which is now the town of Stewart, Virginia. You can see Stoneman's cavalry and all their different detachments are moving all over. They're riding fast, they're riding furious. But the group that we're going to focus on is on the far right here, coming down from Franklin Courthouse, which is right there, just right of Jacksonville and Floyd, that is coming south towards Henry Courthouse. So on April 8, 1865, the 10th Michigan Cavalry, commanded by General William Palmer, made their way down from Franklin Courthouse, which is present-day Rocky Mount, Virginia. They kind of follow what is roughly today US 220, and they camp in Henry County where Reed Creek meets the Smith River, and there's a mill there. It's called Rough and Ready Mill. The mill is there, and it's a source of food. It has large open campgrounds or camping spaces around it. So Wheeler and his men camped there for the night, and there's a picture of the mill when it was active, and the picture below is a picture of what it looks like today. And there's a picture of Palmer as well. You can kind of see where things were. They would have followed the road down from the top left, going through Philpott and present-day Bassett. And then Rough and Ready would be kind of where Edgewood is today, right there. You see it middle, kind of towards the top. They would have been camped right there. Here's another map of it. You can see to the left there where it says number 20 and Waller's. That's old Waller's Ford, which is now Fieldale, and then right above that is Edgewood. So they would have been camped right there on the Rough and Ready Mill, and this map shows a very small print where it is. So this is where the Union Army is camped, right there. And Wheeler and his forces have come in to do a quick screen, and they camp on Jones's Creek, right around in there. That is where the present-day Roselawn Cemetery is. There's also a quick lube service station there. McCabe Baptist Church is there. But that's where the Confederate forces, commanded by Wheeler, would have been camped out. So Palmer and his forces are camping the night at Rough and Ready Mill. And when they're camping there, they send out scouts to look for Confederate soldiers, to look for home guard, because, I mean, if a cavalry detachment shows up in the county, then they know that, they didn't sneak in. So then they know people know they're there. They're trying to get info on it. And there's no doubt a home guard there as well. And they are very, very mindful of that. And some of the scouts that they send out are former slaves that they have picked up along the way. And that is important because, and actually we'll talk about that here in a second. Wheeler's forces are coming out from Lynchburg. They kind of screen the Martinsville area, and they're kind of putting themselves between Danville and Stoneman's forces, because they hear Stoneman's forces are to the west of them, so they go and check out where it is. So Wheeler and his forces would have followed the Danville and Western Railroad, the Dick and Willie as it's affectionately known. They would have followed it west, and they camped on just off the railroad there at Jones Creek. So again, this is where the Confederate forces would have camped. You see Jones Creek right there. You see Roselawn Cemetery there. That is the present day area. Now, I say possible. Most all sources point to this being the camp location for the Confederates. But there are a few journal entries from Union officers that said that when they got to the Henry County Courthouse, which is about 1.2 miles from where the Confederates were camped, 1.2 miles to the south, that when they got there, they rode a mile or so east instead of a mile or so north. So several Union officers said that they were a mile east of the courthouse, which would have put them around Mulberry Creek, which is out near Business 58 in the Leatherwood community. I don't believe that's necessarily the case. I think they got their directions a little mixed up because the Jones Creek one is the more obvious location, given the high ground that it had and its proximity to the Dick and Willie Railroad. So on Jones Creek, the Palmer's forces send out a former slave who's a scout on a Union horse, and he's going out riding around trying to figure out, okay, are there home guards here? How many of them are there? What does the foraging situation look like? Or is there going to be food here? Just trying to get a sense of the area. And the former slave runs across three members of the Confederate Home Guard, who then chase the slave almost back into the Union camp. The three Home Guard members have to stop short of running into the Confederate camp, or the Union camp. But because of that, the Confederate forces now know that where the Union forces are, because these Home Guard guys go back and tell them. And now the Union forces know that there are soldiers who are ready to fight them, and then they know where they are. Once Wheeler and his men are camped on Jones Creek, there's no doubt in my mind that the Home Guard who was there knew that Wheeler was there, so they went and joined him, bolstering his force as well. Because of that, the Union forces knew that they had to take the attack to them, because the Confederate forces were standing in the way of their mission. So the Union forces planned to attack at daybreak, and they march over from Rough and Ready Mill to where Jones Creek is, which is a few miles of a march, and they attack Wheeler's cavalry as they're making their breakfast that morning. The 10th Michigan, under Colonel Luther Trowbridge, attacked first, and they come at them with sabers and pistols, and it's just a cavalry skirmish. Chris Hartman does a great job writing about the details of it in his book, Stoneman's Raid 1865, if you want to read more about that. But it's kind of a stalemate. Both sides neither gain a significant advantage throughout this, and they eventually just decide to stop fighting as Wheeler's cavalry retreats back east towards the county line in the present-day Axton area. When the Union forces were going out to attack, they sent two lines of attack to attack the Confederates. One followed what is pretty much business 220 in Collinsville today, and they marched straight that way. And another group kind of looped around, and they both convened at the Henry County Courthouse, and they were like, "Did you see anything? Did you see anything?" Nope. And that means that they knew that they had to come together and go, in this case, north to Jones Creek to attack. And that's a picture of the Henry County Courthouse as it would have looked in 1865, because that building dates back to the 1820s. The attack began around 7 a.m. There were roughly 800 Union cavalry members and 420 Confederate cavalry and Home Guard. At the end of the skirmish, we have 5 Union soldiers killed in action to 1 Confederate soldier killed in action, and the 5 Union soldiers were quickly buried in one of the homes, or in the backyard of one of the homes, near one of the church cemeteries there. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. And then the one Union soldier, or Confederate soldier, that is his current headstone in Oakwood Cemetery in Martinsville. No one quite got his name, so he is buried as an unknown soldier. But we do know the names of the 5 Union soldiers who were killed. The Confederates then retreat towards, like I said, the Axton area, towards the county line. And that's when Wheeler sends that telegraph to Beauregard that he was attacked. The enemy is soon to be reinforced, because Palmer's group came down first, and then they tell the city, or they tell the citizens of Martinsville, that Danville is their next target. So Union soldiers set up a field hospital at the courthouse in Martinsville and the courthouse plaza square area, and at private residences. There's a home of a doctor named James Moss Smith, which is where current Martinsville City Hall is. They tore down Dr. Smith's house to build City Hall in the 1960s. And that's where Palmer's temporary headquarters is. It serves as also a field hospital there. Union soldiers during this time that are not tending to their wounded are going and plundering what they could from local homes. They're getting food, they're getting forage for their horses. They're basically gearing up for the next ride, and they bury their dead in the local church cemetery, which is across the street from the home of Dr. James Small Smith. Palmer does something here that, probably by orders of Stoneman, sort of defies logic, but once you look at it in the grand scheme, it makes sense. Palmer then, instead of riding east to Danville, and like his men assume that they're going to do, go take the Danville capital. I'm not sure how much Palmer knew about who was there, what was there at the time. Palmer then, instead of going east to Danville and capturing Davis and the unguarded Danville, Palmer then joins Stoneman, who is at this time in Stewart, or Taylorsville, as it was called then. They join up in a place called Danbury, North Carolina, where they then ride south into Winston-Salem. So Palmer goes through a little bit village in Henry County called Horse Pasture, and then cross over the state line into Sandy Ridge, North Carolina, and they reconvene and consolidate their forces in a place called Danbury. And you can kind of see today the route that Palmer would have taken from Martinsville, again, through Horse Pasture, through Sandy Ridge, and into Danbury. And at the bottom right is the home of Dr. James Small Smith. And then that was temporary headquarters for Palmer and a field hospital. This picture is on Church Street in Martinsville, and you see the buildings there, the two buildings there, and behind one of the buildings, going down towards the intersection there, is the present-day farmers market in Martinsville. But right there in that little strip of driveway in between the building and where the vehicles to the right are parked used to be the old church cemetery. This is where those 5 Union soldiers would have been buried temporarily until they were moved to the National Cemetery in Danville. So that little strip of pavement right there that's in between the building and the cars would have been where the 5 Union soldiers and possibly the one Confederate soldier were buried immediately after the skirmish at Jones Creek. Now, the skirmish at Jones Creek is important because it's one of the last official actions of the Civil War, or excuse me, of the war in Virginia. And it does have loss of life. And I like to think about the what ifs. What if Palmer had decided to ride east? You know, what could he have done? Keep in mind, this is April 8th, not April 9th. Lee has not surrendered yet. Lee is on the run. What if Stoneman had decided to defy orders one more time and go and tell Palmer, okay, go ahead and capture what you can capture? What if Stoneman himself had come into Danville and captured Davis? You know, how could history have been different? I know as historians we like to stick to the facts and not the hypotheticals, but I like to think about what could have been different if things had played out just a little bit differently. One thing I forgot to mention before is that Stoneman was definitely a glory hunter, in my opinion, especially given that his roommate at West Point was Stonewall Jackson. So Stonewall was roommates with Stoneman, and Stoneman may have been a little bit jealous of Jackson and his glorification. So he, at least during the war for the most part, was trying to make up for some of that, in my opinion. But here at the time where it seems most logical to gain some glory, or do something that hadn't been done yet, he does stick to his orders, and he rides south to Winston-Salem, where they destroy a clothing factory. I believe that's in present day Winston-Salem. So I'd like to thank these people for helping me out with my research. They are a great group of people, and they've been very willing to answer any questions that I've had. And I thank y'all for listening today, and check out more of our YouTube videos on our channel, and we hope to see you again soon.